I'm Alex Hudson. I have the honor and privilege of being the Executive Director of Transportation Choices Coalition. TCC is a statewide advocacy and policy nonprofit working every day to bring more and better transportation and transit options to people across Washington. We have been doing this work for 27 years now and are honored to be able to make a meaningful impact on the lives of Washingtonians as they seek to have great options around their right to mobility. I am going to take a moment to do a land acknowledgement and a moment of recognition, and then introduce our speakers here, and we'll get right into it. Questions can be entered into the chat feature below. Please, I think you're automatically muted, but please keep your mute on. So, TCC would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are gathered today virtually, our panel is joining us from the ancestral lands of the Anacostines, and over time, the Piscataway people and the Pamunkey peoples, as well as the Canarsie and the Munsee and the Lenape people, as well as the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom are still fighting for federal recognition. Mobility for all cannot be achieved without recognizing and honoring those that first navigated these spaces. And as we work towards building a more accessible world, let's be mindful that we do so on stolen land. Today, we honor with gratitude the physical spaces which we occupy and the Native communities past, present, and future who live and thrive here. We also need to acknowledge the senseless deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and far too many other Black Americans, and recognize that the injustice of their lost lives is part of a deep and shameful history of anti-Black violence and white supremacy in the United States. Racism, police violence, and structural inequity are also transportation problems, and as transportation advocates, planners, engineers, policy and decision makers, we must take an anti-racist approach to our work. So, as I mentioned, we will be taking questions in the chat. This event is recorded, and the video will be sent out and available on our website for folks. Captions are available if you select the closed caption option at the bottom of your screen. So today we have two guests joining us. Stephen Higashide is the Director of Research for Transit Center, which is a foundation working to make cities more just and sustainable through better public transit. He has been involved in research projects exploring why people choose transit, how the tax code increases driving, and transit's role in a Green New Deal. He is also the author of a book that I love, Better Buses, Better Cities, and is an urban planner. Garrett Baldwin is the Director of National Policy for the Center for Disability Rights and leads their federal policy work. She works on ending systemic racism and oppressive systems through policy and activism. Her work includes multiple issue areas, and she has worked on housing and transportation for over 15 years, centering equity in that work. Ms. Baldwin believes in being a change maker with policy that is driven from the streets to the suites, which I love. That is great. So we are going to jump right in. Thanks to everybody for joining us. And Stephen, I'm going to start with you. What is your definition of transportation equity?
Thanks, Alex. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be here with Dara as well, whose work I just think is so awesome. When it comes to definitions, I think of it in a few different ways. I really like some of the definitional work that the Annie E. Casey Foundation has done, talking about how equity involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full and healthy lives. So not an equal amount of everything to everyone, but actually understanding what people need. And it also involves really thinking about justice and fairness within processes. So how resources are distributed and how that decision-making takes place. Another way, another way to think about it is just when it comes to transit and transportation, can you live your whole life if you don't drive, if you can't drive? Can you buy your groceries? Can you get daycare? Can you get to religious services? Can you visit your friends? You know, in so many parts of the region that you work in, and the region that I work in, and the region that Dara works in so many places in this country, the answer is no. You simply can't. There is such really a deep austerity when it comes to transit in most US cities, which is why I think this conversation around funding is so important. But that's really where I start, really asking, what do we need to live whole lives? And how effectively do our transportation systems allow us to do that?
Peace and blessings, everyone. It is wonderful to be here with you as well, Stephen. Always great. And to thank you for Transportation Choices for having me. So I agree with what Stephen was saying. I'm also co-chair of the Transportation Equity Caucus from Policy. It is housed at PolicyLink. And so we've been discussing this for about, I would say 10, 11 years now, as far as centering it in policy work. But, you know, language means something. So what does the word equity mean? Equity is fair and impartial, right? It's so that whenever you set up a system, it should be fair and impartial. And as the, you know, people will set up for communities to thrive. I see this all the time. And the one thing no one ever thinks about is transportation. I'll give you an example. Many years in ending criminal justice and reentry programs, they will talk about finding jobs, finding housing, reconnecting that person to their family, their children, their parents. And never will you see transportation in those reentry programs. And they will get a good job and then lose the job. And they ask the person why, and the person says, because I couldn't get back and forth to work. I couldn't afford it, or I had no car, I had no transportation. And then you also see people set up a transportation system that consists of only that people only need to get back and forth to work. And that is not true. People live full lives. So they need it for work. They need it for worship. They need it for play. They need it, in that instance, that person who is connected to their family. If they want to get to that child that they want to have a relationship with, that is time, and it's outside of their going back and forth to work. So that wasn't included in their budget. Or if they want to take that child to the zoo or to a park, they need transportation to get back and forth. And so equity, right, we have to center people's lives on that. And that we need to set programs up that are coming from those people, from the community. What I always tell people is you cannot set up a program, a plan, a policy or legislation without having people who are directly impacted at the table, who have the lived experience. If you do, your program is wrong. And that is equity, is that you will sit and say, because you could set up a bike program and say, okay, how many bikes do we need? What do they look like? And we see it now. No bike programs in the country were set up for disabled folks, because people thought they didn't need them. And they do. They use hand bikes and tricycles, and you will not find hand bikes and tricycles for all these renting bikes. They all rent for able-bodied people. That's not equity. So that's what we decide, you know, that's how we discuss equity in transportation. Transportation for us is more than mobility. It is a way of life and getting around for disabled people.
Sarah, sticking with you, why is the funding important to that vision?
Sure. So, and I work on a federal level. I live and work here in Washington, D.C., D.C. statehood, D.C. statehood, D.C. statehood. I have to say that. And thank you for honoring, you know, the indigenous land that I am on, knowing that it is stolen land. It is important because just like everything in life, money makes the world go round. Let's not act like it doesn't. And in order to have infrastructure, in order to have things that work well, we need to have funding. And unfortunately, when it comes to transportation, you don't see a lot of push for equitable funding in the areas I was just talking about. You will find it for infrastructure. You will find it, not that is always great, but at the bottom of the list is how is it that people can pay and afford for their transportation to get and go outside of just back and forth to work. And how does that look? How is the safety done on there? How, right? How is it being paid for? Who contributes to it? Like I said, I live here in DC. We have the DMV, DC, Maryland, and Virginia, who split, right, paying for our metro system. It is very difficult. And it's very, like, Maryland doesn't want to pay more than Virginia. Virginia doesn't want more DC. And so you have all of these questions, and they go back and forth around this. So having those voices at the table to discuss not only how much money should be given to a city or a district or a state, but how is that money spent? Where is it spent, and who benefits from that are all very important, which I will tell you are conversations that are missing at the federal level. We need people to be more involved in that.
Yeah,
Steven, same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's that simple, but it costs money to run transit, right? I mean, of course, there's a lot of work that we do at Transit Center. Our transit agencies, our transportation agencies, are they spending the money well? And that's a really important question to ask in a bunch of different ways. You know, for example, we have issues in the U.S. where a lot of the major capital projects like are over budget, they're not managed well, there needs to be some reform there. And then there's the really important question of distribution of service. Is the money being spent in ways that are equitable? But it's just a basic fact that in most places, we don't have the funding we need to provide access to opportunity in places where people desperately need it and where, you know, transit would be very well used. I think about this a lot when you look at some of our, you know, counterparts, other countries, even places where the land use is very much like the US. If you go, for example, to many Canadian regions, there are suburban areas where in the US, planners look at those types of land use patterns and assume that those are places that deserve, you know, hourly service or a bus that comes every 2 hours. You go to those very same types of that land use pattern in Canadian cities, and there can be buses running every 10 minutes or more often, and they get real ridership out of it. And we just have to have the funding we need to provide service and, you know, high quality, good paying jobs. I think that's really especially the case when you look outside the major cities. You know, the state of small city transit and rural transit, these are folks who were struggling before the pandemic and now are having to choose between, you know, getting PPE for drivers or like paying drivers a living wage for the first time is really like deep and desperate austerity. I did have a slide that I wanted to show, slide number 1. This is something that I think is really important for us to be thinking about right now. This is data from the folks at Transit App, who are, you know, a major app having to do with transit navigation and buying tickets, just showing, you know, who are the people who are still relying on transit during the pandemic. They're Black riders, Hispanic riders, Pacific Islanders, the same groups of people who are getting sick and dying more often. They're the same groups of people who we call essential workers, and elected officials have talked so much about the need to honor essential workers, but in so many ways, it seems like that is going by the wayside as the pandemic goes on. You know, you see the grocery stores no longer giving out quote unquote hero pay. But you also really see that at the public policy level, where transit is about to fall off a financial cliff. And it's something that really feels very existential, certainly in Seattle and in most of the major cities in the US. It's not the kind of financial crisis that agencies can cut their way out of. It's a really yawning gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And even at the state level, right here in Washington, less than 10% of our transportation budget is for multimodal. So not only the scale of the issue in terms of recovery to repair what has been the harm that has happened because of the COVID crisis, but even the existing conditions, right, where we're far below what the actual need is for people. Which brings us into the people who do have the kind of money to solve this sort of problem, the federal government. Steve, I'm going to stick with you. Talking about federal funding, many people, and I'll confess, you know, even for me, this was a pretty big black box before this corona crisis. So both of you are experts in this field, but starting with Stephen, can you give us a high-level overview of how the federal funding works for transit with an eye to also how people can plug into that advocacy?
Sure. Sorry, I actually do have a couple more slides. The last slides, I think, of the session, so you can put up slide number 2. So I put these up because I kind of think of this as these graphs as like federal funding 101 and 102. And the 101 is like, in DC, we always talk about the highway transit split, that we spend like a little over $50 billion a year in federal funding. And, you know, depending on the year, it can be 75 to 80% of that on highway programs and just 20% on transit. So that's a huge inequity right there. But kind of hiding beneath that is this other truth, which is that these so-called highway programs, many of them actually could be used for transit. It's just that they don't get used for transit. So if you go to the next slide, that has a lot to do with who is making the decisions, who controls it. You know, the federal highway funding is basically block grants, pass-throughs that go to the state departments of transportation. And the fact that you know, so much of it doesn't end up going to transit is really a reflection of the fact that you know, state governance is controlled. It penalizes cities, essentially. It's only a small sliver of funding that is controlled by the metropolitan planning organizations, regional groups. There's a small part that's controlled by transit agencies. The truth is that, like, any governor could kind of execute their own transportation Green New Deal and just say tomorrow, you know, we're not going to spend all this federal money on expanding highways. We're going to flex a whole lot of it to transit. We're going to use it to fix the sidewalk gap in every city. We're going to use it for active transportation. There's a lot of flexibility that that people either choose not to talk about and they choose not to use. So then I think the last thing I'll say about federal funding that's really important to know is that nearly all of it has to be, or nearly all of the transit funding, that sort of $12, $13 billion slice there, goes to capital projects. And it used to be the case that the federal government would provide operating support to transit agencies of all sizes. Now only small transit agencies can use federal funding to keep buses running and to, you know, hire planners. And so during the Great Recession, for example, we saw that transit agencies everywhere were cutting service by 25%, 30%. They were raising fares, and the stimulus went out, and that funding had to go to construction projects. So transit was getting cut all over the country. Meanwhile, places were getting grants to, like, you know, rebuild rail stations and stuff. You know, there's so much focused on creating construction jobs really not a lot of thought to how do we allow people to keep getting to their jobs via transit. The coronavirus relief bill, the CARES Act, really sets an interesting new precedent where there was $25 billion in operating support for transit, the first time that's happened in decades.
Dara, same question to you about the federal funding.
Sure. So Stephen gave a great example and explanation. I'm going to go like even higher so people kind of, because I do federal policy here, to give you the data. I see the question was that someone asked what an MPO is, and so Metropolitan Planning Organization. So on the federal level, what happens is you have different administrations who do their budget and get their budgets together annually. So, right, the president writes a budget and says, this is what I think my administration needs to function in whatever capacity it is. In this case is transportation. That's the Department of Transportation, United States Department of Transportation. When laws are written, and this is where we as social justice people need to really pick up our game. We have to stop writing laws that don't have appropriations lines. So that means that when you write a law and you say it's federally mandated, that the state has to do it, but you don't fund it. So you have a lot of mandated programs for states to do that aren't funded. So we have to stop doing that. So when we write these laws, but when we do have a lot of laws, as Stephen was talking about, that are federally mandated and federally funded, and they have what's called an appropriations line. That means that when Congress appropriates funds, this federally mandated program that must be funded must be in the president's budget, must have a budget line. Now, the president can say you're going to get $100 million, which was the same amount you got last year, or he can zero it out. The president's budget is only a suggestion. Please always remember that. It doesn't matter who the president is. It's a suggestion to Congress. Only Congress can appropriate funds to any program, whether it's federally mandated or not. The White House, I don't care who's in there, cannot say this is how much the program money has to have, and that's what they get. Right? That's our three legislative, right? That's our legislative, administration, judiciary. Okay, so once that happens, once you have a federally mandated program that gets appropriations, it gets budgeted in Congress. And right, you have the Ways and Means Committee, you have the Budget Committee, and you have appropriators, and they all work together. And in this program that we're talking about, it falls under THUD. You'll hear people say THUD, THUD. That's transportation, housing, and urban development. They're all together. The other, they're all grouped, all of these administrations are grouped together as well. So you'll see DHHS, which is Department of Health and Human Services. All of those programs are together. Then you'll see criminal justice has its own line, right? And they all work on that together. They don't work with them as one. So THUD is worked on, and that's where a lot of your work, and thank you for many of you who we call and say, please get on the phone and call your members and say, we need another $2 million, another $2 billion. And as Stephen has said, we have worked for years to get increases in transportation. It has not worked. But actually over the last 2 years, we've gotten small, tiny increases, but not great increases. So then they work on the THUD bill, transportation, and there are members of us who work specifically on transportation, and that exactly from the slide that Stephen was talking about, money that goes towards highways, money that goes towards MPOs and transit plans, money that goes towards infrastructure, anything around transportation is in your safety and your, how cars and trucks are inspected and looked at. Euro emissions is in there, right? You have Green Deal information can go in there as well to make sure that, you're being environmentally, friendly. All of those things are in there. And so then once it's done, just so you know, appropriations must start in the House. That's also in our United States Congress. It is the House who sets the limit and says, okay, here's the bill, here's the appropriations bill. And they vote on it, and they send it over to the Senate. And then the Senate says, okay, we agree. And we say, okay, give 100, as I said in the HEROES, $25 billion to transportation. The Senate has to agree. and they do appropriations over there. There's a whole process we do over there as well. If they agree, the two come together and the bill goes to the president, they usually sign it. If they don't, it's just like any other legislation or law. There's what's called the people have to come together and have a conversation around that. And so if the House came up with 25 billion and the Senate says, nah, we really want to give them 100 billion, they have what's called a conference. And they have to ask and say, why, the House will say, why do you want to give them 100 billion? And they explain. What you cannot do in a conference, so people understand and notice, and why it's important to make sure you negotiate high, right? Like that $25 billion in the House, you cannot increase. You can't add to anything when they go to conference. So you want to come in at your high number, meaning the House can't say, oh, okay, we're going to say $30 million from the House side. Or if they want to add something into the law, they can't do it. It has to be in there already before they go to conference. So that's why you'll get a lot of emergency emails from us or activists to say, you know, alerts, hey, please call your congressperson because we need this language to be in the bill. So I know that's like a high level, but that's exactly what happens. And then once the bill is signed by the president, that's the budget, it goes to the states. And the states, it goes to Department of Transportation, which is the administrative side of, right, the White House and what happens. And then Department of Transportation decides how those funds are sent out. Some funds are done through grant process. You have to write an RFP for it. Some money is directly sent to the states because it's in the statute that no, you should get this funding. Some money is also held, right, for many years. Like you'll get a funding for a 3-year stream, so they hold it for the 3 years or whatever they're doing with it. And then also finally in this process, I know it's very technical, but I think people should really notice and understand that you do have the opportunity to not only advocate, and people think of as lobbying, it's not. You're telling your members what the money is going to be used for. That is not lobbying. That is telling them, that's educating them. I am a federal registered lobbyist. I do that. We sit here and tell them, you better put $100 billion in there because these people need that money. That's what I was saying, from the streets to the suites. You tell me what you need, and I go and say, listen here, Senator so-and-so, this is what New York needs. This is what Washington State said they need. I'm lobbying. I'm telling them. You are just strengthening what I'm telling them by saying, Washingtonians need this because we have to get back and forth to work. Washingtonians need this because we have to get to school. I'm telling them I'm telling them why, and you need to do this, and you need to vote yes. When I tell them to do a vote, that's lobbying. That's when you overstep. As long as you're just telling them why, you're not lobbying. And so I just want you all to understand and know that we appreciate that is very much what we need. We need it to be driven from the streets to the suites. The suites should not be telling us what to do with funding. So I just wanted you guys to know that. It's very important because I know a lot of people say, oh, we can't lobby, we can't talk to our members. In fact, you can, and in fact, you should. And that is how we got the $25 billion, is because of all those years and all those letters that we had saying these people need these funds. And now we're in a crisis and you think they're going to be able to function? They're not. So that is what it means to be involved in the funding process. And finally, funding process is done a year in advance. So right now we are working on 2021 budget, which means so fiscal year for government is September 1st to October 30th. So that's how we work. So, 2020 is already done. We're hopefully going to get 2021 done in the next couple of weeks. It has not been done yet, so please stay tuned. I hope that was helpful.
Exceptionally helpful. I'm going to go off script. I have a follow-up question for you on that one, Dara, and then we'll get back on track. You mentioned that when the executive sends over a budget for a program that has an appropriation in it, it's a suggestion, it's a starting point, and that the Congress then negotiates from there. If a program has an appropriation to it, does that set a minimum for that suggestion, or can that suggestion be like, actually, no thanks, and they can cancel a program?
That's a very good question. And the answer is no. You cannot zero out a program that has an appropriations line. That's what I was saying. When we write a statute and it says this law must be federally funded and mandated to the state, then they have to give it a number. They have to give it some amount of money. If your program is not federally mandated, here's an example that everybody kind of knows: Planned Parenthood. They want to zero out Planned Parenthood's budget. They can, because Planned Parenthood is not a federally mandated program. It's a program that's there to help out people. And if they could get everyone in Congress to agree, we're going to zero this out, they can, because it's not written in the federal mandated statute for Planned Parenthood, right? In transportation, there's not a lot. Most transportation programs actually are federally mandated and they are to be funded. That's how we did most transport. But so that's what that means. And then also, when you were asking if the president says he wants to zero, he or she one day, or they one day says they want to zero out a program, Congress can just say, yeah, thank you, whatever, see you later. Or even if they want to increase, it's Congress's decision how much money, even if they want to give it more money than what the president decided. That's in the United States Constitution, and that's where that comes. And that's why it's important for us to advocate for more money all year round. It should never stop. We should never have a rest around asking for money.
Thank you for that. I'll just stick with you. So let's talk about your work. Dara, what transit equity and funding policies are you working on right now?
Right now, we are trying. So I'm working with a bunch of people probably on this call. I want to say thank you to everyone. We're trying to get a stimulus. I guess 5 is where we are right now, around like the CARES Act, as Stephen was talking about. It is unfortunate that Congress left here, and they are on recess and they're gone. And when I say we still have to work, even though Congress is on recess, staffers are still working. So just so you know that I am still working, still every day. And we're trying to get $32 billion with a B into this stimulus package for transportation. It is unfortunate. I don't think that is going to happen because it seems like the negotiation is happening now. Which the number is $1 trillion for this next stimulus package, and that in no way is going to help everyone out. It is, again, unfortunate because they're not thinking about the whole scope of things. Right now, the language is really around small businesses being, I'm not saying that I don't want that, but they are not the only people who are suffering right now. It is not looking at fixing UI, the unemployment issue. It is not looking at fixing the rent moratorium or the mortgage moratorium, right? And it's not looking at fixing the transportation for not only for transit riders, but as Stephen, we were talking about, for workers. The workers are essential and they need PPE. And as Stephen has said, right, most transit workers are Black and brown folks. And most people taking transportation are Black and brown folks who are going to these essential jobs. So I'm working on that, and I'm making sure Congress understands that equity and that part of it. And that is the reason why the numbers of people with COVID in this country, positive numbers, and people dying at a higher rate are Black and brown people who have to go work in nursing homes, people who have to go work at prisons and jails. Those are the janitors and the cooks and the people who wash and clean the sheets. Nobody thinks about them as essential workers. They are essential workers because those congregate settings need to continue to run, although we say get them out of those settings, but that's what's happening there. And then finally, another real big area I'm working on is autonomous vehicles, around the equity of autonomous vehicles and the fact that that has been left out. AI, which is automated intelligence, right? And the lack of equity in that. The people who are programming that are white males. And so therefore you don't have equity in that. That's why a lot of AI programs can't recognize dark faces and don't know what's going on there. You don't have disabled people who are coding that. And so therefore, right, that conversation around whether or not that vehicle can recognize a mailbox and a wheelchair and a woman with a stroller or any of those things. So we're working around that and making sure that equity is included in that. And the final thing I say is around safety. And the fact, what does safety mean to you as a person taking public transportation or just walking around or rolling around or being a part of the community. Safety for white folks is not the same as safety for Black folks and for people like myself. And we are really, we've been pushing this for years. These programs that have the E in it, which is enforcement. When you bring in police into any program, it immediately causes harm to Black and brown people. Programs like Vision Zero, programs like Safe Routes, programs that have the 3 E's, empowerment, engaging, or enforcement, which I have to laugh because you as a program, you can't empower anybody. Like I said, it's from the streets to the suites. They empower themselves, right? And enforcement means bringing law enforcement in. And when you do that, you cause us harm. You cause Black and brown people not only harm, but death. And yes, it can happen from traffic violations. That is what happened in Ferguson. That is what happened in 2014 to Mike Brown. And that is what came out in the consent decree if you read it. It started with traffic violations. And so therefore, when you create these quote unquote safety programs that include enforcement, you are killing Black and brown people. And we need to stop that. Vision Zero needs to stop including enforcement.
Absolutely. Stephen, what are you working on?
I just want to start by saying, man, we are so blessed to have Dara working on these issues. She was talking about lobbying before. Transit Center, the organization I work for, we actually are not allowed to lobby, but we can do policy work, education work, and some of that has included really trying to take a deep analytical look at the financial shortfalls that are facing transit. So we have put out estimates of, we estimated that, in the course of a year, transit agencies in the country were facing a deficit of $26 to $40 billion. And so it was good to see the CARES Act include $25 billion to at least get us up to the lower level of that estimate. I mean, we did that work early on, and I don't know, I think things might be worse than we anticipated given how bad the national response to the pandemic has been. So we continue doing that kind of analytical work. We analyzed the CARES Act when it came out, for example, and found that, the way that the money was distributed, places like Seattle, places like the Bay Area and New York, that federal money from the CARES Act is going to run out in like a handful of months, which a lot of that is an artifact of how the money is given out, the types of federal formulas that are used. So I think in the longer term, we're going to do some work looking at, well, how might it look if federal funding was given out in a different way? I'd say another piece of work that I'm really excited about and really speaks to this issue is a report we put out actually like right at the start of the pandemic. The timing wasn't great, but a Green New Deal for urban and suburban transportation. I love the Green New Deal. It did get some criticism from folks in the transportation world that, oh, there really wasn't a lot about transportation in it. Because I view the Green New Deal as more of a set of aspirational principles, an invitation to folks in the broader progressive world to get involved. And so that's exactly what we decided to do with our partners at Data for Progress and UPenn and Transportation for America. We asked, what would it actually look like if there was a transportation Green New Deal? So you can look up that report, and we call for things like $50 billion a year for transit, quadruple the size of the federal transit program. Stop expanding highways, fix the billions of dollars of missing sidewalks that we have in cities, new and old, across this country. That and many other policy recommendations. So, just trying to put some ideas out there that hopefully others can, be inspired by and coalesce around. The last thing I want to mention, I know we're talking about federal policy here, but we have a research project that's also looking at how transit agencies, how do you do outreach in an equitable way? How do you analyze data in an equitable way? How do you hire and promote in an equitable way? What are agencies doing internally? Dara is actually on an advisory committee that we've set up for that. So, she can speak to it also. But I just think that's so important because this is not a question this is not an issue that is just about federal policy. I mean, when we talk about funding, there's a hugely important federal role, but making sure it gets spent well in ways that further equity, that happens at the local level. And so really understanding what are the agencies that are doing a good job now, and how do you build the kind of internal strength and capacity to do that? I think those are really important questions for planners.
Not get through a meeting without talking while still being muted yet, to this day, every time. So Stephen, I'll stick with you. What is working and what's not working in terms of this advocacy and advancing equity at the federal level? So we talked a little bit about distributional equity, decision-making equity. Can you talk about some examples of what's working and what's not, and then Dara, we'll go to you.
Sure. I mean, at the federal level, I think as we've talked about a lot in this conversation, it kind of doesn't seem like that much is working right now. That we're sort of in a desperate situation, and without more funding from somewhere, transit agencies have to make really impossible choices. If there's anything that I think is a really interesting and important precedent, it's as I mentioned, the fact that we have seen at least one example of openness to major federal operating support, which we really haven't seen in decades. And it'll be really interesting to see whether that continues. I think that we also, I'd like to see a lot more thinking about how we make local transit agencies themselves stronger and more capable. How do we create public agencies that have the ability to plan multiple projects at once and keep them on time and on budget, to do outreach in a way that is equitable, to pay community-based organizations as part of that outreach process. I think that really broadly speaking, in the US, we've seen a long trend of devaluing the public sector and hollowing out the ability of public agencies to get things done. I think you see that really broadly, but you definitely also see it in the transit world, where in many cities, the people who work in transit agencies are really, really well-meaning. They're very smart, but there just aren't enough of them. People will talk about budgets being a moral document. You got to look at budgets and staffing. And if you're asking the project manager for a bus project to do all the engagement herself on her nights and weekends, instead of having actual full-time engagement staff, which is the case at a lot of agencies, you just really can't do an effective job, and you certainly can't do it at scale. So I think that more conversations about rebuilding the public sector are really important. And I actually think that Seattle is one of the better examples. That if you think about where Seattle was 10 years ago, there was almost no one inside the Department of Transportation working on transit. And now there's an entire division. There's an entire transit division, for example. And I think that the way that local advocates and policymakers have made sure that every time voters approve more funding, you actually make those agencies stronger as well. And you come up with structures like the Transit Benefit District to direct that funding in important ways. That kind of really nitty gritty practical stuff is super important. So I think that's kind of a rambling answer to your question, but I think you got to look at both levels, the local and the federal.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So I'll give you, a great success that we've had. So as I said, the Transportation Equity Caucus has been around for about 10, almost 11 years. And it was this year that we actually got equity language into the THUD transportation part of the appropriations bill. We had about 12 suggestions, and we got about 6 of those in there around the language, and exactly what Stephen was talking about around equity of hiring, equity of how you distribute money, and equity of including the community. And I saw in the chat box, someone was asking about how do you get conservatives to get on board, and how do you do that? So I want to let you know, also in my work, I don't talk to friends. I don't need to talk to friends because they know us and they know what's going on. They all have my phone number. If they need something, they call me or they email me. I talk to foe all day long. I talk to people who do not understand this. And that is how you get at conservatives. Most people don't like confrontation. It doesn't have to be confrontational. They are your elected officials. You have the right to speak to them. And even if you think they don't agree with you, they need to see it. They need to understand what's going on. Also, people need to understand and know that it's not really the member who does the work. It's the staffers. Let's be real. It's the staffers who do, don't get me wrong, there are members who do some work, but it's the staffers who write the language. It's the staffers who listen to us, right? And I'll tell you, in my work and working in disabilities, right? 4 out of every 5 people have a disability. There's not one staffer or one person in the office who doesn't say to me, oh, my brother has a disability. Oh, my mom has oh, I have a right? And so there's my end. There's my conversation with that person. Even though they could be working for, one of our biggest foes, but they have the voice of their boss, and they can sit there and say, well, let me show you some data. Let me give you some examples. So we need your data. We need you in the community to continue to do the stories and tell us the stories. We need you to go when there's town hall meetings in your town, in your city. Don't just go to the people you like and the people who think like you. Go to the ones who don't think like you, who aren't doing what you need to do. That's where that comes in. And, I can't be on here and not say this. It is imperative that you register to vote and vote every time. Vote for the dog catcher all the way to the president. You have to do that. That is what makes change. And vote for people who think like you. And then therefore we will get these kinds of things. That is how we got this equity language, was years of, I would say, beating these people down. No lie. Just being there every time we said, no, you have to include this equity language. And all of a sudden, right, the things that are happening in this world made even the most staunch conservatives say, okay, I think they were right about some of this equity language, because they also look at it as money. You are spending money over and over again to resolve an issue that still has not been resolved, because you are not looking at it through an equity lens. And that usually gets, right, especially conservatives, around money. They were like, I'm like, you could give them $100 million over and over again, and until this community looks at it through an equity lens, it's not going to change. So that's a way. And then I just also wanted to bring up, because Stephen did, the new Green Deal or the New Deal or anything that is couched in that, since we're talking about equity. The new Green Deal was a racist deal. It was a racist and an ableist deal. It was done in the 1930s when Black people had no rights. Black and brown people had absolutely no rights. And those legislators were not thinking about Black and brown people or disabled folks, because in the 1930s is when disabled folks were put into institutions. So we need to stop frameworking things around the new Green Deal or any new deal that FDR and them were doing, because it is insulting to us as Black and brown folks, and that is not equity. So the next time I've talked to these people around these, they got the new Green Deal coming, you got this other new deal around foster care children, stop using that framework, because if we're going to start from equity, then it's not from 1930s. I was not considered equitable in 1930.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I am going to pivot to, we're in our last 10 minutes here. So questions from the audience. So folks, you've heard a lot. We've got questions, but make sure you're putting them there in the chat as well. So the first question is sort of this idea between federal versus state funding. So the question, I'll read it, is how important will federal versus state funding be to get transit agencies through 2021? What is the relationship between state DOTs and governors in determining transit funding in states? And Stephen, I see you're unmuted, so we'll just start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think of course, to some extent, like all money is fungible, right? And states have a lot of funding to play with, so does the federal government. So I think they both can play a really important role. Like that said, I mean, this is an incredibly deep crisis that we're facing, and states are under financial pressure in all sorts of ways. And so I do think it's difficult to see a total solution without some involvement from the federal government. But I would say don't take pressure off the state. There's a lot of flexibility in the transportation funding that they have, and they certainly have more flexibility and capacity than local governments and transit agencies. So don't let folks, sort of pretend that it is only Washington, Washington D.C., that's the only place that it can come from. The question about governors and state DOTs, I think it's probably going to depend a bit on each state. But I mean, like there have been governors in different states that have really made rethinking transportation a priority, and they've installed people to lead Department of Transportation to make that happen. I mean, it's a state agency. The governor runs the state. If the governor wants to push an ambitious reimagining or rebalancing of transportation, that's something they have the power to do. So I think I just leave it at that, it's not that there's this technocratic distance. If the governor makes it a priority, you should see a lot of change.
Yeah, so this is Dara. So there's a huge difference in the funding stream and how it's done, and it's going to be important. It is going to be imperative that the federal government step in with the funds that are going to be needed, because most states, in the way in which they receive money, it came to a halt. Most states receive money through taxes, right? And through people actually functioning and doing things in your state, which actually came to a halt. Where Stephen is in New York, people weren't going in and out of the tunnel, the Holland Tunnel. They weren't taking the George Washington Bridge. So those funds weren't coming in. And if you're in a place where, you don't have free, you have free highways and things like that, where I am in DC, then it came from somewhere else, right? So hotels were closed. Remember that hotels charge taxes, so that goes into a coffer. When you shop, malls were closed down. All of the ways in which states receive a stream of funding came to a halt, right? Restaurants, movie theaters, right? All the entertainment taxes, all of those things came, right? So those coffers have either depleted or almost gone, right? And so therefore, that is what we have a system is set up for. Federalism, yes, your state, and you can do as you please, but they get money from the federal government, and only the federal government can actually print more money. That's what happened with the heroes. They printed more money. Only the federal government can do that. States can't do that, right? And then states also have an obligation to, right, balance their budgets. How is that going to happen? So it's going to be imperative to have federal movement and fundings coming to the states for multiple reasons. All of these things, kids didn't go to camp this summer. Kids aren't playing sports. All of those things, there's tax money that is, people don't understand it until you sit down. I mean, I had to talk to people about this. Property taxes, they're thinking about increasing property taxes, really, when people can't pay their mortgage, right? Like, let's get these things affect everything we do. And so it is imperative that the federal government is going to have to get in and help out and pad some of this money that the states have lost. That will never come back, right? You're never going to have that Broadway play. You're never going to have whatever is going on where your state received those taxes, those fees, right? From the fees are what drive your state budgets.
Yeah, and the situation here in Washington is absolutely true. Tolling, gas tax, commercial parking tax, like every single fares, right? Every single revenue stream that goes into transportation has been significantly negatively affected, and for months. Final question. What is a next achievable step towards advancing transit equity, and what should we all be coming together around for transit right now?
So I'm going to go back to what I was talking about. We are in a moment right now, praying for Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 times in front of his children in the back by police officers. We must address the fact of what safety means for people in transportation and what it means to include enforcement in that safety. Do not think that the Black Lives Matter movement is not, including transportation. It is not, excluding that. They are talking about Black Lives Matter in all aspects. And when we say law enforcement, we mean transit police as well. As many of you have seen, you guys on the West Coast, what happened at the BART, right, in San Francisco, 2 young men who have been killed by BART transit police officers. In New York, what happened to the young people in the subway system. So, right, we must understand and know that those issues around Black people's bodies and lives being harmed by law enforcement, that is an issue and concern in transportation, and that race is an issue and concern around transportation. So that's what I would like us to see and do. And always remember the history of transportation and the civil rights started with the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King got on that bus on December 20th, 1956 to say the bus boycott is over after 382 days of boycotting the buses. And he said, and now let's start the civil rights movement. Transportation is the key and the essence of the civil rights movement and of equity. And we must always keep it at the forefront of our work.
I just want to build on that by sort of celebrating the work of some of the partner organizations that we work with. I've been really excited and impressed by the work of groups like ACT LA in Los Angeles, and by some of the folks who we know on the BART board of directors who are really taking this work around defunding the police and applying it directly, and it's hard. It is not a done deal. It is just the very beginning in some ways in the conversation there, but they are taking it directly to the police departments that are controlled by and bound up in transit systems, which I think that has to be a real top priority. We were talking about funding as well in this session. I just want to reflect on how over the last decade, we've seen not just in places like Seattle that we think of as so-called progressive cities, but also in places like Indianapolis and Houston, real new funding for transit that was won through broad-based coalitions and organizing. In Indianapolis, for example, you had business interests and realtors, but also progressive faith-based activists who were organizing primarily in Black neighborhoods. And that's the kind of broad base that you need to really change transportation outcomes. Dara, what you were saying about getting conservatives on board, I think about that example a lot because the issue of access to workforce really resonated so strongly. And this question of, is Indianapolis a competitive city. It resonated in a way that wasn't about, you know, attracting millennials to transit, which is a talking point we hear a lot, but it was actually about, you know, can our businesses survive when we have such poor transit access? So there are several places where I have seen transit go from this real state of austerity to something that is, I wouldn't say, you know, full equitable access, but a whole lot closer. And that comes from people doing the local work over time. And I think about that when we're in these moments that seem so hard, that there is actual progress, that there are so people working on this, and you know, wherever you are, you can get involved with what's happening locally.
Yeah, absolutely. And TCC is proud to be a convener and a leader in that space here in Washington. So I just want to wrap up with a huge amount of gratitude to both of you, not only for your time spent with all of us this afternoon, but for the powerful, meaningful, game-changing work that you do each and every day to make sure that people have access to resources. We think about a quote from our last transit chat. Richard Randall, who was with us, put it so succinctly: transportation is power. And the work that we are all collectively doing is vitally important. So thank you. And thanks to our audience for joining us. Here are all the ways that you can keep following along with us. And we hope that you'll join us for our next part of this Transportation Funding is Transit Equity series.
Thank you,
everyone.
Be careful, everyone. Peace and blessings. Thank you.
Yeah, keep the faith.